Washington, November 8, 2024, the Federal Reserve raised the benchmark interest rate by 0.25%, marking its fourth increase this year to combat high inflation. The Fed chair stated this measure aims to control rising prices and support economic stability. Margaret had always found comfort in the quiet rhythm of her farm in rural Vermont. The way the morning sun spilled over the rolling hills, the gentle clucking of the chickens, and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind gave her a sense of peace that no city street or busy office could offer. She had spent years tending to her animals, planting her vegetables, maintaining the old farmhouse that had been in her family for generations. Life was predictable here, and for someone like Margaret, that was exactly what she needed: order, simplicity, and the reassurance that the work she put into the farm each day had tangible results. With her daughter Emily away at college in Boston for the summer, Margaret's days had grown quieter than usual. The absence of Emily's lively chatter and occasional teasing left the farmhouse feeling emptier, almost echoing. She missed the small things, the way Emily would greet her in the kitchen while brewing her morning coffee, the laughter they shared while feeding the animals, and the way her daughter's presence seemed to fill every corner of the house with warmth. Margaret tried to keep busy, focusing on her chores, the garden and the animals, yet a part of her could not shake the feeling of loneliness. Even the dogs, normally so playful, seemed to notice her quieter mood and stayed closer than usual, their soft panting a constant companion to her thoughts. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that the unexpected happened. Margaret was inspecting a new fence post near the barn, making sure it was level and sturdy enough to hold the boundary wires, when she heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle on the gravel driveway. The low hum of an engine gradually grew louder, cutting through the tranquil silence of the farm. Margaret straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron as she squinted toward the road. That's when she saw the pickup truck turning into the driveway. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew she wasn't expecting any visitors today. Curiosity mixed with a hint of unease as she walked toward the house, brushing loose straw from her hair. As the truck drew closer, she realized who it was. David, her daughter's husband, was pulling up in his well-maintained pickup. She had only met him a handful of times, mostly during family gatherings and Emily's wedding. Seeing him here at the farm, unannounced, was both surprising and slightly unsettling. David stepped out of the truck with a friendly smile, carrying a basket that looked full of fresh produce, homemade bread, and other small items. "Margaret, I hope I'm not intruding," he said warmly, setting the basket down on the porch railing. "Emily asked me to bring some supplies to the farm while she's away. Thought it might help a little." Margaret blinked, a mixture of surprise and polite appreciation crossing her face. She hadn't expected anyone, let alone David. And though his visit seemed thoughtful, it was unusual for someone to arrive without notice. She managed to smile, feeling the strange flutter of curiosity and a little bit of warmth at his friendly approach. "Thank you, David. That's very kind of you. Please come in, I'll get you some iced tea." As they sat together on the porch, sipping the cool drink, Margaret felt a curious sense of ease in his presence. David had a calm, attentive demeanor, and he spoke with a kind of easy confidence that made conversation flow naturally. They discussed Emily, the farm, and the changes in the neighborhood over the past few months. Margaret found herself laughing at stories she hadn't heard before, and David's genuine interest made her feel seen in a way that was rare. There was no pretense in his words, no need for social formalities, just simple, honest conversation that warmed her heart. After a few moments, David suggested they take a look around the farm together. Margaret hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. Walking side by side, they inspected the vegetable garden, checked on the animals, and even examined a small leak in one of the water troughs. Margaret couldn't help but notice the care with which David approached each task. He was methodical but gentle, taking the time to ensure that the animals were comfortable and the plants well tended. His attention to detail was impressive, and Margaret found herself admiring not just his skill but his attitude, thoughtful, patient, and quietly confident as they worked together. Margaret felt a strange sense of connection forming. It wasn't romantic in a traditional sense, at least not consciously, was deeper, subtler. She appreciated the way David listened, how he asked thoughtful questions, and how he shared small stories about Emily's life without boasting. It reminded her of the companionship she sometimes craved in the quiet stretches of the farm. Someone to share the little victories and challenges of daily life with. Time seemed to pass differently with him there. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden rays across the fields, highlighting the beauty of the farm in ways Margaret hadn't noticed before. She laughed more than she had in weeks, feeling lighter than she had since Emily had left. David's presence brought a kind of unexpected energy, a mixture of comfort, joy, and subtle excitement that made her heart race in ways she hadn't anticipated when it was finally time for him to leave. Margaret felt an unusual pang of disappointment. She waved as David loaded the basket back into his truck, appreciating the thoughtfulness of his visit, yet also realizing how much she had enjoyed the companionship. "Thank you, David," she said sincerely. "The farm looks better already," smiled warmly at her, a gentle glint in his eyes that conveyed both respect and kindness. "It was my pleasure, Margaret. I'll make sure Emily knows everything is in good shape while she's away. But I have to admit I enjoyed this. It's rare to get time away from all the chaos and just be out here." Margaret nodded, feeling a quiet flutter of emotion she didn't fully understand. She watched him drive away, the rumble of the truck fading into the distance. As the last traces of sunlight vanished behind the hills, she realized that something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just about the work they had done together. It was the unexpected connection. The sense of being understood and appreciated in a way that went beyond simple politeness. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch after her chores, staring out at the starlit fields. She replayed the day in her mind, the laughter, the stories, the simple moments of shared work, and felt a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She reminded herself that David was her daughter's husband, and she would never cross boundaries. Yet the feelings of companionship and appreciation were undeniable. For the first time in weeks, she felt lighter, more alive, and oddly inspired. The next morning, Margaret woke early, the memory of David's visit lingering in her thoughts. She moved through her routine with a renewed energy, checking the garden, feeding the animals, and repairing a fence near the barn. Each task was done with a sense of mindfulness, as though the presence of another caring adult yesterday had reminded her of the small joys of life she sometimes overlooked then. As she reached the edge of the driveway, she saw a familiar hum approaching. David was back, carrying more supplies, this time a mix of tools, seeds, and household items Emily had requested. Margaret's heart skipped again, a mix of anticipation and curiosity stirring within her. There was no awkwardness in his presence, only the same warm smile and easy conversation that had made the previous day feel unexpectedly special. Together, they spent the morning planting rows of tomatoes, repairing the chicken coop, and discussing the farm's upcoming projects. Margaret found herself opening up about her fears of being alone, the challenges of managing the farm by herself, and her longing for someone who truly understood the rhythm of her life. David listened attentively, offering encouragement and thoughtful suggestions without ever overstepping. His calm presence was soothing, a gentle reminder that emotional connection could be safe, respectful, and meaningful. By the time the sun reached its peak, Margaret realized that the farm had taken on a new vitality. The animals seemed happier, the gardens more vibrant, and her own heart more open. She felt grateful for David's thoughtfulness, his willingness to help, and the warmth of genuine human connection. Even as he prepared to leave again, she knew that the impact of these visits would linger. Not because of any inappropriate feelings, but because he had reminded her of the quiet joys of companionship, understanding, and shared purpose. That night, as Margaret settled into bed, she reflected on the past 2 days. The farm was still the same, peaceful, beautiful, and demanding, but her perspective had shifted. She had realized that human connection could appear unexpectedly, bringing warmth and light to even the quietest corners of life. And while she remained aware of boundaries, she understood that it was possible to experience profound emotional connection, gratitude, and companionship without compromising her values. For Margaret, Part 1 ended not with resolution, but with the sense of anticipation, curiosity, and subtle emotional awakening. The farm had remained a place of solitude and work, but now it had also become a space where unexpected bonds could form, and where the quiet hum of life was accompanied by the gentle presence of someone who truly cared. The following days at the farm carried a sense of routine that Margaret had always cherished. Yet now there was an unexpected undercurrent of anticipation. Every sound along the gravel driveway seemed to echo in her mind. Every distant hum of an engine made her glance toward the road, half expecting to see David's familiar truck pulling up. She caught herself smiling more than she intended. And even the simple chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, watering the vegetables, felt lighter, as though his presence had left a subtle warmth lingering in the air. It was midweek when the first sign of surprise arrived. Margaret had been in the barn checking the new fencing when she heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Wiping her hands on her apron, she turned to see David stepping out of his truck with a small toolbox and a bag of supplies. "Thought you might need some help with the barn repairs," he said, smiling warmly. His timing, though unplanned, felt almost natural. Margaret couldn't help but chuckle at the coincidence. "You really have a knack for showing up when needed," she said, her voice light with amusement. As they worked together, hammering new boards into place and tightening loose nails, Margaret found herself observing him more closely. David moved with a quiet confidence, precise yet patient, always making sure she was comfortable with the pace. He joked occasionally, teasing her gently about her tendency to overthink small tasks. And Margaret laughed more freely than she had in weeks. The sound of her own laughter surprised her. It was unrestrained, warm, and honest. They paused mid-morning for a break, sitting on the edge of the barn steps, sipping iced tea and wiping sweat from their brows. The sun had climbed high into the sky, casting golden light across the fields. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for the beauty surrounding them, but also for the rare companionship she was experiencing. Conversation flowed effortlessly, covering topics as varied as Emily's recent college stories, local farm news, and even favorite books and movies. There was no need for pretense or social formalities. David's presence was simply comforting. And Margaret realized how much she had missed genuine adult conversation. It was during this break that the first unexpected moment of personal connection occurred. David glanced at Margaret with a softness in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. "You know, Margaret," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I can see why Emily talks about you so often. The way you care for this place. It's remarkable. It's clear how much of yourself you put into it." Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly at his words. They were simple, honest, and entirely appropriate. Yet the sincerity behind them stirred something deep inside her. She smiled, a blush warming her cheeks. "Thank you, David. That means a lot. Sometimes it feels like no one notices the little things." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary before returning to the barn repairs. Margaret shook her head slightly, trying to focus on the task at hand. Yet the warmth of his compliment stayed with her. It wasn't romantic in the usual sense. It was deeper, a recognition of her effort and care. And that acknowledgement made her heart beat faster than she expected. As the day progressed, the two of them moved from the barn to the garden, inspecting the tomato plants, checking the irrigation system, and discussing ideas for crop rotation. Margaret was impressed by David's knowledge and willingness to learn about the farm. He asked questions, made suggestions, and occasionally pointed out areas where her own approach might be improved, but always with such respect and tact that Margaret felt encouraged rather than criticized. His involvement felt like a partnership, even though she reminded herself constantly that he was her daughter's husband. Lunch came unexpectedly. As David unpacked a small picnic from his truck, he had brought sandwiches, fresh fruit, and lemonade. Setting it out on a worn picnic table beneath the shade of an old oak tree, Margaret felt a flicker of surprise and appreciation. He had thought of everything, down to the small comforts that made a day outdoors feel leisurely. They ate together, sharing stories and laughter. the conversation flowing easily, as though they had known each other far longer than they actually had. After lunch, they decided to tackle the more physically demanding work, repairing the small irrigation system near the northern field. Margaret climbed down into the shallow trench, adjusting hoses, while David handed her tools and gave guidance when necessary. They worked closely, but respectfully, side by side. And Margaret found herself noticing little things, how carefully he watched her movements, how often he offered a reassuring word, the way he smiled when she managed a tricky adjustment successfully. It was a simple, innocent connection, but it carried weight she hadn't anticipated. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather in the sky, signaling a potential storm. Margaret glanced at the horizon, worried about the weather, and David suggested they finish the remaining repairs quickly before the rain arrived. They worked efficiently, speaking less and focusing more on the tasks. But the quiet moments were filled with unspoken camaraderie. Margaret realized that in his presence, even silence felt comfortable, and shared it wasn't awkward or tense, just mutual understanding and companionship. When the first drops of rain began to fall, they retreated to the porch, laughing as the storm intensified around them. David fetched blankets and hot cocoa from the kitchen, and they sat together watching the rain drum against the roof. The rhythmic sound was calming, and Margaret felt an unusual sense of closeness to him. She was aware of her own emotions, the warmth, the flutter of unexpected excitement, and the subtle longing for connection, but she reminded herself constantly that boundaries were important, and she would never cross them. Yet the experience was undeniably stirring, a mix of companionship, gratitude, and gentle curiosity. As the rain eased, David helped Margaret check on the animals and ensured that the barn was secure. The storm had left the fields fresh and fragrant, the air filled with the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. Margaret found herself taking deep breaths, savoring the moment, the environment, and the company. David's presence had transformed what could have been a mundane day into an experience that felt significant, almost intimate in its simplicity and authenticity. Later, as he prepared to leave, David lingered at the edge of the driveway. Margaret felt a pang of reluctance. She had grown unexpectedly attached to his presence, to the ease of conversation and the shared work that had made her feel alive again. "Thank you, David," she said sincerely. "Today has been wonderful. I didn't realize how much I needed this." He smiled, his eyes reflecting a gentle understanding. "It's been my pleasure, Margaret. It's rare to find a place and a person who make you feel at home instantly. I'll make sure everything is ready for Emily, but I have to admit, I've enjoyed spending time here too." Margaret nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and subtle longing. "I'm glad you came. It's nice to have someone to share the work with, and to talk to." He waved as he drove away, leaving Margaret standing on the porch, watching the truck fade into the distance. She felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, realizing how much she had enjoyed his presence, yet also understanding that it had been perfectly appropriate, supportive, and kind. That evening, she reflected on the day as she sat in her favorite chair by the window, the farmhouse quiet and peaceful. She realized that her emotions were complicated: warmth, appreciation, curiosity, and gentle longing, but none of them crossed the line of propriety. Over the next few days, Margaret noticed subtle changes in herself. She moved through her chores with renewed energy, her interactions with the animals and plants infused with extra care. She caught herself imagining future visits from David, thinking about conversations they might have, and feeling a quiet excitement at the prospect of his presence. These thoughts were innocent and respectful, but undeniably stirring, reflecting a deeper need for connection and acknowledgement that had been absent during Emily's absence. One afternoon, as she worked in the vegetable garden, David arrived again, this time with a box of supplies Emily had sent. Margaret greeted him warmly, and he stepped out of his truck carrying the box with ease. Together, they unpacked seeds, gardening tools, and fresh produce, discussing planting strategies and ideas for the upcoming weeks. Margaret realized that she was increasingly looking forward to these moments, the shared labor, the conversations, and the simple pleasure of being in the company of someone who genuinely appreciated her efforts. The day passed quickly, filled with laughter, work, and the gentle building of trust and familiarity. As the sun set, painting the fields in shades of gold and pink, Margaret felt an unexpected contentment. David's presence had become a source of quiet joy, a reminder that connection could appear in surprising ways, bringing warmth, companionship, and a sense of being seen and valued. She knew boundaries were important. Yet she also understood that emotional bonds, friendship, respect, admiration could be deeply fulfilling and entirely appropriate. As part 2 came to a close, Margaret realized that her days were no longer just about routine and solitude. They were now infused with anticipation, subtle excitement, and emotional richness. David's visits had created a space where she felt alive, appreciated, and connected. And though the relationship was entirely platonic and respectful, the following morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual, stirred by the lingering excitement from David's previous visits. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the farmhouse in soft gold. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts kept drifting to the day ahead. There was work to do, of course, but she found herself anticipating another chance to see David, to share laughter, and to experience the quiet connection that had grown over the past few days. By mid-morning, he arrived as reliable as ever, carrying another small toolbox and a smile that seemed to brighten the entire yard. "Morning, Margaret," he greeted, his tone easy and familiar. She returned his smile, feeling a flutter in her chest at the sight of him. Today they would tackle the old greenhouse, fixing broken panes and reorganizing plants. The work promised to be challenging, yet satisfying, and she felt a thrill at the thought of tackling it together. The greenhouse was a small, weathered structure at the far end of the garden. Its glass panes were dusty, some cracked, and the interior was cluttered with pots, old soil, and unused equipment. Margaret rolled up her sleeves, ready to dive in, and David followed, moving beside her as they planned the day's work. Their collaboration was effortless. He suggested methods for clearing the old soil. She offered insights about the plants. And together they created a rhythm that felt surprisingly intimate yet entirely appropriate. Hours passed quickly as they cleaned, repaired, and organized. Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't realized she was missing. The greenhouse began to take shape, each pane of glass shining in the sun, each plant carefully positioned for optimal growth. Their conversations wove in and out of work, touching on memories from Emily's childhood, favorite recipes, and even the local wildlife. With every shared laugh, Margaret felt a deepening bond of connection built on respect, understanding, and shared effort. During a brief pause, as they wiped sweat from their foreheads and sipped lemonade, Margaret noticed the softness in David's gaze. "You know, Margaret," he said thoughtfully, "it's rare to meet someone who cares so much about everything they do. The way you nurture this farm, it's inspiring." Margaret felt warmth flood her chest. His words were gentle, heartfelt, and entirely innocent, yet they struck a chord within her. "Thank you, David," she replied softly. "That means a lot. Sometimes I feel like no one notices the little things." He nodded, smiling faintly. "I notice, and I think Emily is lucky to have you guiding her life and this farm." The day wore on, and as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they moved on to planting new seeds in the reorganized greenhouse. Margaret marveled at the ease of working alongside him. There was no tension, no awkwardness, only the quiet satisfaction of collaboration and companionship. Every small gesture, the way he handed her tools, the careful attention he paid to her explanations, the laughter shared over minor mishaps felt significant, a reminder of the power of human connection. By late afternoon, the greenhouse was fully functional, and Margaret stepped back to admire their efforts. The structure gleamed, the plants stood in neat rows, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh soil and budding flowers. She felt a quiet pride, but also a sense of gratitude toward David, whose help had transformed a daunting task into an enjoyable and meaningful experience. As they cleaned up, a sudden rain shower forced them inside. Margaret laughed as they dashed to the porch, shaking off droplets of water, and David followed with an umbrella. They stood together, watching the rain patter against the roof. sharing the comfortable silence that had become increasingly familiar. In that moment, Margaret realized how much she valued his presence not for any romantic reason, but for the warmth, support, and understanding he provided. It was rare to find someone who could make hard work feel lighter and solitude feel less lonely when the rain stopped. They returned to their chores, ensuring that everything outside was secure and protected from the wet weather. Margaret noticed how thoughtful David was in every task. He checked the gates, arranged the tools, and even moved a few heavy planters for her without being asked. Each action reinforced the sense of care and attention that had drawn her to him, and she couldn't deny the growing appreciation she felt as evening approached. They carried the last of the supplies back into the farmhouse. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields, and Margaret paused to breathe in the warm, fragrant air. David noticed her moment of quiet reflection and offered a smile. "It's a beautiful view," he said simply. Margaret nodded. "It really is. Days like this, they remind me why I love this place so much." He lingered for a moment, the sunlight catching his hair, the warmth of his presence filling the space between them. Margaret felt a flutter of emotion, not romantic, but deeply human. It was the kind of connection that made ordinary moments extraordinary, the kind of companionship that nurtured her heart without overstepping boundaries. Before leaving, David helped Margaret carry the final items to the storage shed. They moved side by side, laughing lightly at a minor spill of soil, and Margaret felt an odd mixture of joy and longing. She knew that these moments were fleeting, that he would return to Emily and his own life. And yet she cherished the time they had shared. It was a gentle, quiet thrill, the kind that came from being seen, appreciated, and understood. Finally, as he prepared to depart, David paused at the truck. "Thank you, Margaret," he said sincerely, "for letting me help today. I've truly enjoyed it." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth that stayed with her long after he drove away. "Thank you, David, for everything. You've made this week special." The following days were quieter, filled with the usual farm routines. Margaret felt a lingering sense of happiness, a quiet glow that had not been present before David's visits. She reflected on the experience often, recognizing that the bond they had formed was meaningful, wholesome, and entirely appropriate. It had been a connection rooted in respect, care, and companionship. And yet it had stirred her emotions in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, Margaret sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the fields in hues of orange and pink. She thought of David's smiles, his words, and his gentle attention. There was no guilt, no improper behavior, only the realization that human connection could appear in unexpected ways, bringing joy, support, and emotional richness. She felt grateful for the experience, knowing that it had reminded her of the importance of companionship, empathy, and shared effort in a world that could sometimes feel lonely by the end of the week. Emily returned from her trip. Margaret was filled with excitement to see her daughter, eager to share stories of the farm, the progress made in the greenhouse, and the beauty of the fields after the rains. When David visited briefly to deliver a few final items, Margaret realized that their bond had not been about romance, but about trust, shared effort, and the human need to feel seen and appreciated. It was a subtle, respectful, and meaningful connection, one that left both of them smiling as he waved goodbye once again. Margaret knew that life at the farm would continue as before, with the daily routines, the chores, and the seasonal work. Yet now, those routines carried an extra layer of meaning. She had learned that companionship could arrive unexpectedly, that moments of connection could enrich the soul, and that emotional bonds could exist without crossing lines of propriety. She felt renewed, hopeful, and deeply aware of the simple joys in life: laughter shared, work accomplished together, and the quiet acknowledgement of one's efforts. As part 3 drew to a close, Margaret stood in the garden looking out at the fields bathed in the soft glow of twilight. She felt a profound sense of contentment, knowing that her experiences with David had brought warmth and depth to her days, without ever compromising her values or the respect due to her family. It was a story of human connection, trust, An emotional intimacy, one that celebrated the beauty of understanding, the joy of shared effort, and the subtle, meaningful ways people can touch each other's lives. Margaret turned back to the farmhouse, sense of peace settling over her. The farm, the work, the quiet laughter, and the companionship she had found were all part of a tapestry that reminded her that life could be deeply satisfying when hearts were open to connection, understanding, and the gentle rhythms of everyday life. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes the most meaningful experiences were the ones that arrived quietly, unexpectedly, and entirely in the right spirit.